Unmute.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome everyone to our May 2022 CVTA Finance Committee meeting. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We have a few things on the agenda today to get to, and so I know we will be efficient, but we will also have good discussion as well. Ms. Firestone, would you please certify that we have a quorum?
Yes, sir. Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll.
Here.
Hanover County, Vice Chair Peterson.
Here.
Henrico County, Mr. Thornton.
Here.
City of Richmond, Chair Stoney.
Here.
And Commonwealth Transportation Board, Mr. Brown.
Here.
Thank you. We do have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Firestone. We'll move on to item 1 on the agenda, the consideration of amendments to the action meeting agenda. I have no changes to the agenda. Are there any changes from the committee? Seeing none, we'll approve the, all in favor of approving the agenda, vote by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Nays? Ayes have it. We'll move on to item 2. The approval of the April 13th, 2022 CVTA Finance Committee action meeting minutes. Do we have a motion to approve the April 13th, 2022 Finance Committee meeting minutes as presented?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
The ayes have it. We'll move on to item number 3, the open public comment period. Is there anyone from the public who signed up to offer comments either online, by email, or in person?
Yes, sir. No, we don't have anyone who has signed up, and no one participated virtually who's indicated they wish to speak.
All right, there's no one that signed up on virtually or no one here publicly to speak, so seeing none, we'll move on to item 4, the CVTA Finance Committee Chairman's Report. I do not have a formal Chairman's Report for today, so I think it's best that we move on to item 5. Item 5 is the CVTA Activities Report. Mr. Parsons?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 7 of your agenda packet is the financial activities and investment reports. Actually, I believe it's starting on page 6 and 7. And for your information, I'd be happy to take any questions on it, but it's an update of activities as of April 30th, 2022, in terms of distributions, transfers, and then our balance in our operating fund and regional fund.
Are there any questions on the financial activities and investment reports? Okay, we have TAC activities.
Yes, sir. Ms. Clark is with us today. She chaired the last TAC meeting.
Not me, I did have a, so I was still looking at page 6. If I go to page 7, I did have some, I know Hanover County has, this is showing nothing on here, but we've had encumbered funds on a number of the projects that we have. Should that be, this is part of this report?
Those be local funds, Mr. Peterson?
Pardon?
Are the encumbrances local funds or the regional funds?
In the local funds.
So if you've encumbered them, we don't track that. We just, the financial reports from the CVTA are just the disbursements to the localities, but if you've encumbered them, the projects.
Okay, so the projects that are on here that are showing nothing on them, the fact that we've
Mr. Peterson, you're actually looking, I believe, at the quarterly expenditures,
yes.
which is not, that's an update later in the agenda.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I thought you included saying that was part of this.
No, sir.
Okay. Do that later. Excuse me.
No problem, Mr. Peterson. The next is the TAC activities report. I know Mr. Yuri's not here, correct, Mr. Parsons?
That's
There it
correct.
is.
Oh, well, there he is as well. Well, today, we have Mr. Aruna Clark with the City of Richmond providing the report on behalf of the TAC. Ms. Clark.
Good morning, everyone. Diana Moore Clark. I had the pleasure of serving as the chair of the last meeting, as I'm the vice chair of the TAC, as Mr. Ure enjoyed his vacation. So for an update, TAC really took a focus on the I-64 and the gap funding issue that came before us. Really, we requested additional information because we only discussed strategies that we needed to come up to close the gap. So some of the things from that meeting that came up was that, we talked about, was the I-64 project gonna be considered in a full or holistically entirely of what is the gap, or would it be broken down into segments? So those are some of the items that we asked for the consideration of this committee as well as the full body, is to provide TAC with more direction on those items. Again, there was input from Mr. Brown that talked about the benefit of the entire project costing $750 million, and with the funding gap of what $100 million would do to that, it would potentially allow it to score better in Smart Scale and the CVTA regional. There was also asked for consideration that the TAC consider 2 different models and potentially funding it, again, looking at what would $100 million do to funding it, and then what would funding it in smaller segments look like. And all of these things are things in which the TAC needs further direction from the committee and or the full body. We also discussed needing additional information from VDOT. They were looking to give more direction on other funding streams, and also looking to see what could be done before the entire Smart Scale process application closed in August of this year. So again, looking for more project details from VDOT and more directions from the administrators, the Secretary of Transportation, and the other committees. Lastly, we just briefly talked about the fall line and the location public hearings that took place, as well as the SPA agreement that exists between VDOT and the CVTA, as well as some of the other projects that we're moving forward with fall line, as well as looking forward to moving, prioritizing the other projects for the existing funding that remains for the fall line trail. So, any questions?
Any questions for Ms. Clark? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Clark. All right, now we'll move into old business. Item 6 here, unless you have anything else, Mr. Parsons.
Yes, sir.
Move into old business. Item 6 is speaks to committee membership. I believe we have this on the agenda to at least have a discussion. No action items, no action on this necessary today, but have discussion on at least a proposal on enlarging this committee to additional members outside of the 5 that have been laid out by the bylaws, correct?
That's correct.
You want to add anything else, Mr. Parsons?
I believe at the last meeting, towards the end, it was a pretty busy meeting, but Mr. Peterson raised the question about possibly expansion to provide more exposure for our rural jurisdictions as part of the authority. And then I think the committee thought that was pertinent to have further discussion.
Fair enough. I'll open the floor.
Mr. Mayor,
Mr. Peterson.
I brought it up as just as an idea for us to think about. I thought about it more. I think the key thing there is not necessarily the size of this committee as much as making sure the smaller jurisdictions have action. So I think we can look at this in either 2 ways. We can expand the size as a committee to do that, or we can basically take the 2 positions that Mr. Brown and I have and work with them in such a way that we make sure that the smaller jurisdictions get in. I think it is, I still think it's very important that the voice of our smaller jurisdictions is heard here in this forum.
I will add to that and say, I think, since we are still in our infancy as an authority, we're going to get, whether it's the leadership positions of the entire authority, which also include the chairmanship of the different committees, but also the seats on these committees as well. We start building ourselves into a rotation. I think. Obviously, all of us will not be in office forever. I don't think we desire to be in office forever, or to be in all these seats forever as well. And I think that we need to create a cycle like you would see on any board or commission that's seen, whether in your locality or at the statewide level. Fair enough? I think we can create that.
Mr. Chair. I think it's a great idea. I think that when we get to full committee, a recommendation could be to the chair to establish a committee to look at two things. One, of the rotation in the future of leadership, both with the regular committee and how that ties in with the finance committee as well. And two, also a discussion with the whole authority on whether or not it would be necessary or could we expand the finance committee. I do think that having the input of all the members, I think is important to come back with that to the full committee for consideration. Because it would require a bylaws change. And so it
would require, yeah.
It would require the full committee to chair, whoever that may be, to appoint people from the CVTA to have deliberations on that and then report back to the full committee on that.
Yeah, I'm a believer in intentionality, and I think that we have to be more intentional about including our rural counterparts in the region in one of the seats that are already given, created by the bylaws. I think in our infancy, I thought we found it very appropriate that we involve, let's say, for instance, the CTB. Obviously, Mr. Brown, you've been, your contributions, they've been valuable to this committee, but we know that you won't be on the CTB forever as well. And, there'll be someone who will be a fresh face and we'll just be learning the ropes at CTB. So we will obviously miss you when that time comes. But how do we, account for including our friends in the rural parts of our region on this committee and in leadership overall?
Mr. Chairman, just one thought, and just occurred to me. Two things. One, you could designate your CTB member and/or the chair of the broader authority as ex officios, and thereby open up to of the existing seats. That would give you the benefit of having that relationship or that engagement from the CTB member without taking up on the designated seats. That's just one concept of expanding the committee, but still keeping that engagement. I will tell you, if you haven't heard, that I have declined to serve another term on the finance committee, just because I think it's appropriate to have some other representation, but also just because of some other commitments. But I do think that maybe having that individual designated as an ex officio might be another way to skin that cat, such that they're there even if they're not with both. So.
I think there are many ways to skin the cat out, and I like that idea as well.
Mr. Chairman, you may recall, other commissioners may recall that when the CBA commenced, there were a few words that were used, but one of the key words that we used was collegiality. And then you add to that collaboration, and also we use the analogy of family. So I think it is really tremendous on the part of this advice group to start thinking about future changes. Because what we got to understand is what you said, Mr. Chairman, actually it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the district, it belongs to the people. But it is germane for us to make that foundation strong, super strong. And I'm thinking that as you look at enlarging committee from finance, that's the only proper thing to do. And what we need to start taking a look at too is not only enlarging that for the financial part, but we need to take a look at other things we've seen as we are working on the foundation. This morning from the finance committee perspective, but somewhere I think germane to this too might be a time for us to start thinking about since we're really talking about good collaboration and good collegiality, that what about the smaller localities also having opportunities for leadership? And we have not broached that. That's something that I'm sure the present chair will mention. So I just wanted to just mention to this group that there's no doubt we're going on in the right direction of what we're doing here, because CVTA doesn't want us, but we are practitioners trying to put the best one in place. And that's what I'm very proud of. So I think we're moving in the right direction. As David Crockett said, I don't know why he said it. If you're right, then go ahead.
Sounds like a good Virginian. Good Virginian.
Mr. Chair, in the CVTA meeting, when this was discussed, though, it was brought up, and I think it was a valid point, that we were to go to 7 members. That's more than the majority of the members of the entire CVTA.
Yes, exactly.
So that's probably, I'm not too sure after thinking about it that I don't like Ms. Brown's thought of, I do like the idea of having the CTB at this table, but we have his idea of letting two seats work in a rotation and still having the CTB here, this issue. I sort of like that idea.
Seems appropriate and proper.
And that's why I think we need to put a committee together. I think that putting the right people together to come up with a recommendation will solve the issue.
So that we can stake up with the body?
And just to follow Mr. Carroll's comments, the nominating committee has discussed this as well.
Oh.
And I think they're prepared to bring the recommendation to the board.
Well, I think I would love to hear back from the nominating committee. Are they prepared to bring that to the authority when?
That is not to me.
Okay. Good. Sounds good. Discussion had. Anything further? All right, we'll move on to item 7, the investment portfolio. And who's providing the update for that?
We have to put that along.
Oh. Hello, how you doing this morning?
Good morning. Rebecca Longmaker, Treasurer, Chesapeake County, and I also act in the capacity as fiscal agent and the cash for the CVTA. And it was brought up to last meeting, I believe, why the investments are sitting in LGIP and VIP and not in other investments.
Can you just, the acronyms, can you explain the
I'm sorry.
acronyms?
They're both liquid investments. Local Government Investment Pool, LGIP, and that's run by Commonwealth of Virginia. VIP is Virginia Investment Pool, and that is run by Virginia Municipal League, Virginia Association of Counties, and investments. Their rates, all rates, have been incredibly low. They're finally coming up to be something that we're going to actually see some return here. But that also means that other rates are coming up as well. The county itself, Chesapeake County, has been watching this for our own investments. But we know our cash flows. I don't know the cash flows for CBTA region yet. I can't send something out into maturity and you won't need it back right away. I hear from the meetings, because I do follow them, that there's 850 million or 700 million in projects. Well, right now there's 91 million sitting in the regional investments. 1 million stays in the bank at all times. That's only a small piece of it. So I don't know where all the other pieces are coming from. So I don't want to put out an investment and have it say it's going to mature in a year and you only get 6 months. And then I have to sell it and I have to take a loss. And that's where we always hold ours to maturity for that reason. We don't ever lose the principal, we keep that safe. So that's basically why it is where it is. I have met with PFM. I'm going to set up another meeting with my investment manager and PFM so that we can kind of lay out a game plan. I've met with Mr. Parsons and Mr. Yor, and they're going to work on a cash flow statement template, at least for me, so that I have an idea of when monies are going to be needed, so that I'm not tying things up and holding back projects.
Mr. Chair.
Yes,
I think the majority of the money that's sitting there too is money we dedicated to the fall line, is that right?
That I do not know, because I don't know the projects.
Well, I think it's the last 2 years of money that has come into the CVTA, and I think the first 2 years of the monies that we put into the fall line And I think it's important to find out also what VDOT's timeline is, because they're the ones who are gonna be managing and overseeing those projects, Mr. Mann, if I'm correct on that. And so that'll actually help to establish, where those projects are, as to actually when funds would be necessary to be needed.
So once I have that, I can go further out. Every month, about 5 to 7 million comes in. So I can start doing the laddering, so about 6 months, next month, buy another investment, 6 months. So as you need it, it's available, but I'm putting more back in there, and then we're stretching out as long as we can, and getting the best returns. You also don't want to go out too far right now as the rate's going up, because you got interest rate risk right there. And we're seeing some of that with, when we first thought we were gonna be held in one place, and then the rates kept going up.
Everybody comfortable?
So to answer your question, Mr. Peterson, I think you want to brought up the last meeting.
Well, it does, but it also says we have some work to do.
Yeah.
To make sure we do it correctly.
That's my whole point, is to do it correctly.
Okay. All right. Ms. Longhanger, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, move to item 8, the third quarter reporting update. Mr. Parsons.
Yes, sir. This is circling back to the item that Mr. Peterson raised earlier on page 8, the fold-out page in your agenda, shows the quarterly expenditures through the third quarter of FY22. This is a tool that we put in place back in the outset of the organization to track expenditures at the local level, so that we would be accountable and have an understanding of where we are on a quarterly basis leading up to our end of year certifications. So what you have here is voluntary reporting from each of the member jurisdictions. Those that chose to submit reports showing what the projects are that each jurisdiction is engaged in with CVTA funding, with the appropriation and the expenditures from not only first 3 quarters of FY22, but also the entire FY21 fiscal year. What it doesn't show is the expected expenditures into the future. We have a separate report for that, which we are wrapping up now. I believe we received our last slate of projects for member jurisdictions, so I'll be able to put that together this week and have it ready for the next authority meeting. But again, this is just we'll call it a quarterly update, showing where we are moving towards our certification for FY22 expenditures. And this is, as Mr. Peterson raised, we have suggestions in terms of what should be submitted by the jurisdictions, but again, it's not a requirement, and we're taking the information that staff receives and putting it in a table that hopefully is useful.
It seems to me, Mr. Parsons, that many of the jurisdictions around the table here have submitted this voluntarily?
Yes, sir. Yes. And in a lot of cases, the ones that you don't see on the page haven't expended funds. So.
Have that question there, like I say, voluntarily, I'm not too sure that, I don't maybe at a point in time that we were supposed to submit stuff voluntarily, we wouldn't have a problem. We've got about, at this point, between $2.5 and $3 million that's encumbered. We've let the contracts, we haven't spent the money because they hadn't completed the projects, but it's encumbered. And I guess technically it should be on the sheet. But we've got money encumbered for the Southtown widening of 301, the Green Tea at 30 and 1, the roundabout at Cold Harbor. We've got started the planning on a number of about 5 or 6 projects, committed the funds for that. So.
Yes, sir. We'd be happy to follow up with Zach and make sure that we have all these figures correct as well, and maybe oversight just to know.
Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of banks here, and Hanover may not be the only one.
Clark?
Just, Mr. Chair, thank you. Just to answer Mr. Peterson, these are expenditures that have been actually spent and not just encumbered. So encumbered, you know, you have a PO with a contract.
Right.
This report asks for dollars that have been invoiced and a check has been paid for.
Okay, that's
That's clear,
clarification.
yep. Okay. Very informative. Any questions? Any further questions? Okay, we'll move on to new business then. Item 9 is the I-64 gap funding, is what it says on the agenda, I believe. We touched on this topic earlier, and we have it here on the agenda just to have a further discussion on the topic.
Mr. Chair.
Yep.
I would ask Mr. Mann, who's here from VDOT, if he has anything he can contribute to that in reference to the 64 project.
Sure. Mr. Mann?
Met with the commissioner several times over I-64 based on the last CVTA meeting discussions. And he wanted me to convey that this is a priority of the administration to finish this gap. VDOT does have a plan to deliver the work. We're going to, right now we're doing some final work on the engineering side out there. We're doing some geotechnical work. If you've been down the road, you've seen some holes where we're punching in the pavement to get some more data. We plan to put out an RFQ by the end of this year to start this project. Depending on the available funding, it'll either be the entire project or a piece of it. We plan to start, if we don't have entire funds, we'll start on the ends and bookends, start moving towards the middle. We're waiting on General Assembly to find out exactly how much funds will be available for General Assembly. We understand in the draft budget, there was up to $190 million dedicated to 64. We are applying for a federal grant. That application is due today, so that'll be going in, and we expect a decision in the September to October timeframe. Any monies that CVTA were to look to dedicate to this project would not be needed until 2025, 2026. We would look to expend any General Assembly funds or other internal funds prior to using CVTA funds. And just in general, we're ready to go. We're finishing up the environmental this summer. We're finishing up the engineering that we'll be doing, the preliminary engineering now. So we're ready to go. So that's kind of the message from the commission.
Mr. Mann, it sounds like to me, so, but I'm hearing that the General Assembly is very close to sealing a deal on the budget front, and I know that there's I guess you could say, no pun intended, a gap between the Senate and the House's budget, and any idea where they might land on that?
I don't believe VDOT, that Mr. Brown may have more information on that than I do, but.
I believe the Senate budget is with 190 million, the House budget is high 50s.
High 50s, and Delegate McQuinn represented that she had spoken to Chairman Knight and that he understood the urgency and, but did not signal, but he thought it would be in the higher range.
And is it fair to say that we would not be the only regional authority that would be contributing to the project as well?
I think that VDOT has an ask to HR TAC as well. I can't speak to whether they have acted on that yet or not. I believe we have an ask.
So to be a shared investment potentially.
All right. So, Mr. Chairman, just to add a couple queries, just for Mr. Mann, just to draw some additional. The grant that VDOT would submit to the infrastructure bill, what range are we talking there? Just,
I believe the ask was in the $100 million range.
Right.
So,
there was a whiteboard. What I'd point out is our estimates for to do the entire project is what?
approximately $750 million.
750 million. Let's split up a little bit. What's 700?
Every time you ask.
So if everybody has a whiteboard, just to kind of work, make these understand. So you got 750 million And that, that's the high end, VDOT typically delivers at a little bit better, a little bit better with some pressure on this. We got 190 in the Senate budget, so let's just call that 150 to be conservative. You get 100 million from the IJAC or the infrastructure bill. So you got 250. Based on my conversations with the secretary, I know his ask from the CVTA and from HR TAC is about 125 each.
I heard north of 100, yes.
Right, so we're about 150, 250, 400 million. With IJAC, $500 million. So I got a $250 million gap. From that $250 million gap, if you were going with the entire project and into smart scale, you'd be getting 750 million. You'd ask for 250 for a 750 project that would have the benefits of the entirety of the gap, which I don't want to speak for the smart scale team, but my sense is that would score pretty aggressively. In addition to that, there's smart scale proper, there's the, what's the right term, Mr. Mann, the significant corridors of significance.
Corridors of statewide significance.
Statewide significance. So there are two pots at the state level. There's the corridors of statewide significance. There's the interstate money on 64, and then there is the district grant program. So essentially, what you are doing is you're building your stack. And by going in competitively, buying down the $750 million project, it positions the 64 gap holistically to compete very well against the other projects for those other three pots of money. Mr. Mayor, am I misstating anything?
I think that's a perfect explanation. The more we can buy it down, absolutely better it will score.
Right, and Mr. Mann's gonna probably get that down to 700 million by the time the application goes in. Be a little pressure there. So, but to make this work, we have to, now, I'm quoting Secretary, we gotta know everybody's in. We have to know everybody's in, because to go through the smart scale competitive process, with integrity, right, we have to say, well, we know there's $500 million on the table to say that we're only asking for 250. Likewise, in the federal grant process, in order to competitively ask for 100 million, that was a little bit higher, but ask for 100 million, we got to be able to say, yeah, we know that we already have, in theory, 500. The request is that, and I understand all the sensitivities around the existing funding scenario that was submitted. And the timing, but here's the rough math. I'm looking at the December revenue forecast that you all received from Ms. Farmer, would suggest that between 22 and 28, the CBTA would generate about $1.4 billion in totality, and that's the lower estimate after it was revised. Actually, it might actually have gone back up. But of that 1.4 billion, if you take 35% of that, which is the regional pot, right? Remember, we got a better split than they did in Hampton Roads and Virginia. But 35% of that is $485 million. We have programmed $276 million, which leaves a gap of $209 million. That is not programmed in this 6-year period. So 209 million of the CVTA regional pot has not yet been programmed. As we understand it, VDOT would look for its contribution, assuming everything else happens. Here's the other thing, and Mr. Urick made this comment when we talked about the scenario initially. A number of these projects are being introduced and programmed in the CVTA schedule under the assumption that they get funding, matching funding from Smart Scale, which they may or may not. And so if those dollars don't get the match from Smart Scale, then these dollars will not be expended by the CVTA. Likewise, if the CVTA were to commit 125 million to 64 for the years, let's say year 26, and it doesn't receive all the other dollars that we're talking about, then those dollars don't get spent. Meaning that there's nothing lost by committing or pledging. And again, the analogy that I referenced, which you all are familiar with, is the fall line letter that you all gave to me in December, where I simply said, look, because remember, the CVTA had not approved a funding scenario, right? Meaning that there had been no approved schedule of funding at the time that we did that in December. I said, I can't go in and reprogram state dollars on a hope and a dream with nothing to rely on. So you guys gave me a letter that said the CVTA is committed to fund, and the letter says, it's underlined here, $104.5 million for fall line. That was before this body had actually programmed money. I used that, I relied on that, I took it to the state, the CTV, and we then brought back, how much, Mr. Parsons, collectively, did we end up coming to? 42 additional $1 million. So we've done it before, it's worked. And because of that, the fall line now is going to be basically completely funded. And I've shared this with the secretary, I talked with him last week at the CTV meeting, we would simply like a similar scenario where this body says, we'll do 125 million, year 25 or later. We don't say how we're going to pay for it, where it's going to come from. We know there's 209 million that's not been programmed. Between what we'll find out about the federal grant in this fall or early September, October, we'll do the smart scale scenario by next June. So by next June, we will know whether we have 64 funded or not, and whether we will call on the CVTA for the 125 million. If we don't get the federal grant and we don't find the funding in smart scale or otherwise for 64 by next June, that letter gets torn up. So the ask here in substance is that we follow the same model we followed the fall line. We commit so that Mr. Mann can, in his letter to the federal authorities, say we have this much committed from the state and from CVTA, and then we can in the August application to smart scale, so we have this much committed, so we can legitimately say we're only asking for 250. But again, there's no consequence if the rest of the money doesn't come. The CVTA, these dollars go back to the CVTA for. So that's the discussion.
And I would say, Mr. Brown, I will tell you what I told the secretary as well, is that first I know that the federal government will have an objective way of scoring and measuring where it will invest. And I know that Mayor Mitch Landrieu is in charge of that process. And so I have no problem talking to my friend and letting him know that we are serious about what we're trying to do here in Central Virginia. And secondly, though, I'm very interested in not only a letter like that from Central Virginia Transportation Authority, but also the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission as well. I want to see if the state government is asking for Central Virginia to have some skin in the game. Well, I'm also interested in seeing the Hampton Roads have some skin in the game. Right. And I think if I have belief, confidence that the secretary can deliver on that, because he is I guess you could say still a Hampton Roads resident.
We had a little sidebar over here earlier, and if we have the regional funding scenario that was brought to the full CVTA last time, was designed but it was the last 4 years of our 6-year plan. The first 2 years were dedicated to the following. The question is, rather than a letter, if we revise this funding scenario to be just what it is, and make it instead of the last 4 years of our 6-year plan, let's let's start a new 6-year plan, and let these be the first 4 years, and add the 2 years following, which is when VDOT needs the money anyway, and bring I-64 into our scenario. Am I making any kind of sense at all here? And then that gives us something that we have made our commitment as part of our funding scenario to I-64. Yeah.
Yes.
Couple things. I don't disagree with what Mr. Peterson said. I think that's something that could happen in full committee after we have a consultation with PFM. I think our financial advisor needs to be part of that. I do think there is capacity, as Mr. Brown said, to be able to do that. I absolutely agree with you that it's imperative that we find out a couple other things. One is that Hampton Roads Transportation Authority going to actually participate. I'm hearing something different, so I'm hoping I'm wrong. But my indication is that one of the things that we need to get from them is what's their capacity. As we know from a previous report from them, they had over $5.6 billion in projects that they had funded out. And I don't know how much bonding capacity they may or may not have left in the future. So that's something we need to get from them to determine whether or not they can do that. I think, Mr. Mann, you said the ask for the federal government is going to be $100 million?
In that range, I'm not sure exactly.
I would hope the ask was higher. Just saying. Chesterfield has already written a letter in support of the federal application, and I asked Chet to send it out to all of the CVTA members to see what we put forward. But I think another recommendation that needs to happen, which the chair and I have talked about, is that the CBTA needs to have a letter sent from the chair on behalf of all of our members to several. One, to all of our members of the legislature, asking them to support the dollars that you spoke to about in the Senate side and the House side, and try and get them to say, if you can't do 190, do as much as you can. I think it's important for that letter to come from the chair on behalf of all of the members of the CVTA. The second thing I need to happen is a letter from the chair also needs to be sent out to all of our congressional members and our Senate members, asking them to support the federal application for the 64 wide. I've already spoken with several myself, but I think it's important that the members of Congress know that all of the regional partners in the CVTA are in support of the widening of 64. We would ask them to support the federal grant to make that happen. I do have a couple more questions, and that is, Shane, in the northern part of Virginia, I drove up there a couple of weeks ago, there's a huge widening project going on 95. Do you know where the money came from for that project? Was that a Northern Virginia Transportation Authority project? Was that a VDOT and federal project? I'd like to know where the money came from that. And then also the Interstate 81 project, and maybe Mr. Brown may have some that he can talk to you about that. Because I think, they didn't have a regional transportation authority for the 81 project. And I'm curious to see if they get these questions answered. And also, when you look at the widening, which is fantastic, by the way, in Hampton on 64, was that an HRT project, or how was that funded?
Yeah, so I can speak to all that. I know PFM can also speak to it because they're the financial advisors. 95% of all of the widening in Hampton Roads was done by HRTAC.
Okay.
It was all their money. Which, again, let's remember the genesis of this. We copied the idea for the CVTA was because of what we saw happening in Hampton Roads in Northern Virginia. They used their dollars to advance projects, to buy down projects. The reason we could not compete in the smart scale process was because the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, just to be the most poignant, 3.86 billion, 3.55 billion came from HRTAC. For anyone to say that that is not a regional, in light of our military infrastructure down there, that's not an area of national significance, and for Hampton Roads itself, through its authority to pay for 3.55 billion, the largest individual project in the history of Virginia, the state contribute the remainder, roughly $300 million. Why did they get the $300 million? Well, because they had brought it down to the point that, so guess what? Nothing else got funded, right? All of the statewide corridor significance funding went to contribute that 300 million to help close the deal on Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. But how do you complain about that? When you put 3.55 billion of your own money up, how can the state not come in? Now, again, and I think that's, we can go through the other scenarios. I-81 is essentially a regional authority. I mean, that bill was, if you look at how that's managed, it essentially is a regional authority, but as opposed to it being a region like Hampton Roads or Northern Virginia or Central Virginia, it is a region that is really surrounds that corridor. So its board, the group that has oversight over its structure, looks just like us, but as opposed to it being I forget how many jurisdictions are tied to I-81.
Quite a few all the way.
Yeah, it would dwarf it looked more like our TPO than it would be, or our planning district than it would be what we have at CVTA. So it's the same structure. I mean, and so the bill was done to leverage, and in that case, because it's a corridor, they did the truck fees and truck taxes and dedicated it to that corridor first. So again, the model really is, if you want significant interstate infrastructure done, the local regional authority has to participate in a heavy way. We do have the 64 fund. And again, all that money is going to Hampton Roads again. Why? Because they bought down all their projects. So the 64 fund, and explain that, Mr. Mann, how that works.
Well, as part of the I-81, there was a portion of that went to other interstates in the state, whether it's 64, 95. I believe it's proportional to the truck traffic, if I'm not mistaken. But 64 does get a number, I don't know off the top of my head how much it is, but it's basically the same type of competitive process for those projects. And as Mr. Brown mentioned, Hampton Roads has bought down most of those projects where they're pretty hard to compete against for the rest of the state.
So, either we're going to be in the game or we're not going to be in the game, so that's the opportunity. Fortunately, we don't have the same level of interstate challenges. We do have other corridors of significance, some that I think, they not yet be on the table. But again, I think we would want to have a similar model where we're going to want, to use a salad bowl of different funding sources, right? State and local, and regional, to be able to complete these other significant projects that we may have coming down the pipe. Like BRT could be one, the Powhatan Extension opportunity could be another one, where I think we're going to want this collaborative model to exist. And I think in this case, because of the federal opportunity and because of the state budget surpluses, this moment now is more significant for 64 than any, and it creates a greater opportunity for it to be less expensive if we do it now.
Chair.
Mr. Carroll.
First, I want to thank Mr. Brown and Mr. Mann for the explanations of the different funding scenarios. I think it's important. It's an important conversation that needed to be had. It's an important conversation for the community to know about, and certainly an important conversation for all of the commissioners to have an opportunity to know what can happen. And I do think that, from this, at a minimum, this committee should send a recommendation forward to the full committee for a letter of commitment and up to, I think, $125 million, pending confirmation from PFM on what that capacity would look like, whether we could do it as pay-go, as Mr. Brown said, which is potentially have $209 million available, or if we do it as a bonding issue. Either way, I think it's a recommendation this committee can bring forward to the full committee for consideration at our next meeting. I'll make that the form of a motion.
Well, there's a motion on the table. Is there a second?
I'll second.
The motion has been seconded. Open up the discussion.
So we're not, or the scenario that it's already been applied, this is separate from that scenario.
Yes, it would add on, it would add
So
on
we
to
would-
that.
So we would be adding on to that.
Well, the motion is to, at a minimum, a letter, but at the full committee, we could have a full discussion. And the full committee can make a recommendation to say, you know, we want to vote to change, to add this on to year 5 or year 6. In addition to what we've already done. There's no, we don't necessarily have to change what we've already done. We can add right to the end of that. But we need to talk with PFM to make sure, to get our best, recommendation on whether it should be as the pay-go or whether we should do the bonding. If we do the bonding, we actually, as Mr. Brown has said, we may have other projects that are in our $276 million package that don't score, that money comes back in, and we can actually, you know, tie that capacity up longer, but it could be a much smaller number on how we do that.
And this is a letter specifically to who?
So to the CTB, which is what he's requesting.
Well, you know, as I stated earlier in my comments, is I want to see a commitment or a pledge coming out of Hampton Roads first before we jump into the game. Obviously, we have some flexibility to get there, but I do need to see a pledge from Hampton Roads before I can commit.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may, and I understand the desire to see that. I guess the thing that I would just remind everyone of is that whether or not, I mean, you know, it's kind of a chicken, the game of chicken here. And as we know, Hampton Roads has already, as we've described, spent and come to the table multiple times on 64. I know there's work there. I mean, part of the scenario that I was working on even last year was with 97 million from Hampton Roads, that I know that there was an active conversation on with Kevin Page. I guess what I would say is it does not prejudice the CVTA in any way to go first. Meaning, because again, if Hampton Roads doesn't show up, then as I think the secretary shared with you all directly, everybody has to be in. So if Hampton Roads is the last group standing, then there's going to be considerable motivation applied to Hampton Roads to get involved. If they don't come to the table and we can't close the financial gap, then our letter gets written up, our letter gets ripped up and there's no consequence. I guess what I'm saying is we're not being prejudiced in an irreparable way, used to use a legal term here, that by us going first, we're going to be harming our interest, so to speak. And the reason I would suggest that we not do this is because, political interest and communities all have their own personalities, and we don't want to necessarily let that get in the way of progress here. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mr. Chairman, so one of the things that I see, I always see the CVTA as doing the right thing by one of its members. But one of the things is I'm listening very carefully to a discussion like this, is a tendency, or just maybe my understanding of it, that we have to be a little bit on guard about the state's responsibility and the federal responsibility about these things too, like 64. And I don't think that an authority like the CVTA would not do its part, but at the same time, I don't know whether it should be used only to do things like this. I guess what I'm really saying is we got to make sure, as long as we do our due diligence, that the state and federal government have to do their part also. And I don't hear that in some of the comments sometimes. And then too, I'm just a pragmatic person. If you're gonna depend on another colleague somewhere else who has a similar program, I don't know where that program is saying. I like to have more input. One of the things that we've been doing is we've been talking about numbers, but we want to make sure that numbers are really there. That's what concerns me. You know, I'm hearing Mr. Brown is one of our authorities on how to do these things. I want to make sure that the right numbers are what it should be, and I want to know what's in the pipeline for VDOT and all those places like that. And sometimes we don't have that information. That puts, I think, us in a bad situation. Now, we don't want to omit a good opportunity. I do think at the same time, we need the pertinent information. I don't mind having a letter written with my name on it to the people who can do things, but let's make sure we keep a clear mind on this. We got some of the best people around these tables, right?
Well, I think what if you mind me adding to your comments, Mr. Thornton, Mr. Chair, you don't mind supporting a letter, but a letter with a solid number in it would be too premature.
Oh, yes, yeah. Because see, there,
And I
not dealing with.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I'd rather hear from PFM. I support a letter of support for the project, and then we gotta figure out, we're not ready for 125 million yet. I don't think anybody around the table can commit to 125 million today, because I believe the last time we talked about this was 100 million. So are we talking 100 million? Are we talking 125 million? What I do know that we all agree on around the table is that we support funding the gap.
Then respectfully, Mr. Chairman, then I don't need the letter, it doesn't matter. If there's no, again, and respectfully, Mr. Thornton, I want to try to clarify, if you've not heard me say this, the way this works is the state is building a package of funding that they're going to go to the feds and ask for, and then we will go to the smart scale process and ask for. But to compete in that process, when you submit a project, for example, if I look at the list, if for example, and with what this body forwarded, there were a number of projects, for example, Henrico, West Broad Street, short pump improvement, $20 million the estimated project, the request was $3 million. There are some other sources of funding that Henrico is going to bring to the table, and they're saying, CTVA, you give me 3 million, I can come up with 17. But the 3 million is what they're asking to be committed. It may be that they're asking for some of that from Smart Scale. When they apply to Smart Scale, they're going to say, we have 3 million from CVTA, this much from the district, from Henrico, and we're asking for the Smart Scale process to give us 5 million. But if you can't come to me with that package, then Smart Scale is not going to give you credit for that. Likewise, when we did Fall Line, the letter said CVTA is committed to 104 million. They had X number of dollars already otherwise committed. They said, we need you now to close this gap. So the process is going to be, both the feds and Smart Scale is going to evaluate, what do you have committed? And so a letter that simply says we support it is zero in the calculations. So I can't tell this body whether it should be 100 million or 100. I'm telling you what the secretary asked me for. The secretary said 125 million. He said he's going to ask him for 125 million. The application that goes into the feds, I thought we had a solid number, but again, 100 million. The issue simply is, we have to put firm numbers in these applications to be able to have them scored. If we don't have firm numbers, we can't score them. The number goes into zero. So I'm just trying to tell you how the process works objectively. I'm not trying to lecture anyone, but if you don't put a number in it, then it effectively equals zero.
And Mr. Brown, I know exactly what you're talking about. When is the full body meeting?
We have a planned meeting after this with the chair, vice chair. June.
If I could ask a follow-up question. Mr. Brown, what's the timetable on the requirement for the letter that you have to have?
Well, again, I think the secretary, well, for smart scale, it's gonna be August. So that is, I'll use that as the date, that by August is when we will move that letter, uncertainty.
Mr. Chair, follow-up question. My understanding is that, so I'm asking for clarification on this. There was a project that was submitted by the TPO, a smart scale project for, from exits 205 to 211 for 64 widening. And that was the only smart scale project that was submitted, to my knowledge, for 64. So the money that would be committed, would it go for that particular smart scale project, or would it go for the entire widening?
Well, and again, I can let Mr. Parsons speak to this. There were some technical issues with how that application came in that could have been addressed in what we call the TA process, right? Where you want to talk about that?
I mean, yeah, we've been in constant discussion with VDOT about the flexibility. We're in the pre-application phase right now, so this is not the full application, so we're hoping that scope could be amended if needed, that we have some flexibility with the extents of the project. We're still trying to figure out what's the most competitive project as well. We think that there might be some opportunity one way or the other. If you just focus on that section with CVTA commitments to buy down the cost of the project and make it more competitive, that's an option. Or if possible, and we'll work with VDOT to make sure this is a possibility, is we expand the scope to the entire 29 miles and leverage CVTA dollars and other dollars against that. So I think we hope that there's some flexibility there, and we're trying to figure out.
If I could ask a follow-up question, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sure.
Of the 29 miles, how many miles are actually outside of the CVTA's authority? So in other words, there's a section of this that's in James City County that falls under HRT. Do we know how many miles of the 29 miles that relates to?
Very few.
Less than 5, so the number probably, but it's a fairly small number.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think it's important to say that, I'm not trying to be split hairs here, but if for some reason the HRT does not want to participate in this, then those areas of 64 that are outside of the CVTA authority, we shouldn't commit our dollars to widen that section of 64. We certainly could use our dollars for the section of 64 that's within the CVTA. And I do think that, again, we need to look at what's the best way for that to score. So, as an example, like Mr. Brown said, what if you do get $100 million from General Assembly? Can you put that towards the 64 for that particular 205 to 211? And then if you had a commitment from the CVTA for even $100 million, we've got $200 million now against smart scale for that project. It's going to score better, as opposed to if you expand it to 29 miles and you only have $200 million, it's not going to score as good. And I think potentially what we want to make sure, no matter what funding scenario we look at, is we're going to maximize our ability. And then I think it is important on the federal application, if they know that we do have skin in the game and we are going to do it, then we may have a better opportunity to get a federal grant, as opposed to going, well, the state's not putting anything up. So, if the timeline is August, then we can have a more robust consideration moving forward, especially with the full committee. We can actually nail down perhaps what HRT's commitment would be, and we can make sure we schedule a meeting in July that would give us the opportunity to have a bigger discussion, both in the next finance committee meeting and at the full committee meeting. So Mr. Chair, what I would say, since we're still under discussion, and we could certainly take an up or down vote, but we could just table the motion for now until we get more information. I think we have some time to be able to do that.
Mr. Peterson.
Mr. Chair, I'm not too sure we're really, this gap is very important to our entire region, the type that CVTA represents. And we cannot control what HR type does, or the state or the federal, but we can control what our commitment is. And for us to make a commitment that we're going to do our part, if the others don't step up, nothing's going to happen. But I agree with Mr. Brown. I don't see any reason why we can't commit and say, we're going to do our part, and if the others do not, that kills the issue. And apparently we have the fund, we do have our financial advisors here with us today. And if we could, I'd like to ask them, are anything we're talking about here gonna be detrimental that you would see from, if I could ask them, Mr. Chair, their advice?
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, could I add one comment,
Please.
For what it's worth, staff has, since the last full authority meeting, we've gone back and looked at funding scenarios. And we see multiple options that it is successful if you commit each dollar in and out year. So I think that certainly shouldn't derail any conversation.
correct. And here's the thing, Mr. Parsons, I think we are all well aware of that in the out years, the fiscal year 25 and 26, that yes, the authority does have the capacity to do such. Hence, that's why I think everybody around the table supports that we should make this investment. What I don't know is what is the number that this body supports yet? Is it 125 million? Who knows if someone's gonna come to us after the budget is passed on June 1st and says it's 150 million?
It's true, Mr. Chairman.
I mean, am I wrong if I don't mean, we gotta see the whole field, everyone, the whole field. And so June 1 comes, and let's say the money that we were expecting in the budget doesn't end up in the budget. So the whole letter gets ripped up, and we start from square one again, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right. And I guess.
I guess,
Yeah.
here's the thing, Mr. Brown, I think we all want to get to the same place. And this is like a chicken or the egg sort of thing, where I'm more, maybe you can call me conservative on this one. I'd rather see, I'm in, I'm all in. Now, the number we write in that line, 125, 150, 100, that's the only thing that's holding me back is what number we writing on that blank.
Right.
Mr. Chair, what I could say then is I could amend my motion to say that we would bring this forward for consideration in the full committee in a July meeting.
Well, that's what I was trying to get to when I asked Mr. Parsons and said we don't have to write the number down today.
Right.
We can say, draft a letter that says we commit to this, then let's get the number from the localities to all agree on, and we can pass that letter at the July meeting, or whatever meeting that's coming up next.
Yeah.
Because remember, June 1, we don't have a budget yet.
Right.
Number one. Number two, we haven't heard from HR tax yet, which these things should not dictate, but it's not, we have time to get to where we want to go.
Well, I think the vehicle I was trying to do was to make sure that there was some motion that comes out of the finance committee meeting that would bring it to the full committee for consideration. And so certainly I have no problem with amending the motion to say that we put this on the floor for full consideration in full committee, and not just, and to see at that point what the number looks like and what the full committee can make as a recommendation. So I would amend my motion to that. And I don't know if Mr. Brown or Mr. Peters would like to second
Do
that.
we want?
Jeff, are we still here from our finance?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
No,
TFM.
I agree with what you just said in the approach. There's more details that we want to work through, but everything y'all are discussing is completely reasonable.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, just so everybody understands, the premise upon which funding projects outside of the footprint of Planning District 15 would be an understanding of the statute that doing so would benefit the localities comprising Planning District 15. So just to make sure, because that's what the statute says, that any projects funded by the CVTA have to benefit the jurisdictions comprising Planning District 15, which I think it's fair to say that this project would, but I just want that to be understood.
I agree. Thank you.
Mr. Gray, are you clear on what my amended motion is?
No.
That was my next question. Because we need to make sure we have that right.
Yes, sir.
So it's, what I'm trying to do, amending the motion is to, thank you, Mr. Mayor, is to make a recommendation forward to the full committee for consideration of this matter in the form of a letter and or a dollar amount pending further information being provided to the CBTA. What I don't want to have to do is to go through an another finance committee meeting to try and get something out. I'd rather bring it forward to the full committee and have all the information necessary so we can take action in the July meeting, which will allow us to meet a deadline.
Yeah, I think, if you don't mind me adding some comments to that, all we need is know then by that time, hopefully the work is done, that we can just fill in the blank.
So, Mr. Brown, would you agree to the amended motion?
No, that's perfectly fine.
So then you have the first and
So
second.
motion has been seconded.
In a second, yes.
First one was withdrawn,
Yes.
new motion was made, it was seconded by Mr. Brown. Discussion, any further discussion? If not, Ms. Fires.
Thank you. Mr. Carroll?
Aye.
Vice Chair Peterson?
Aye.
Mr. Thornton?
Aye.
Chair Stoney?
Aye.
Mr. Brown?
Aye.
Thank you. The motion carries.
Motion carries.
So can,
Move
just
on
for
to-
the record, can you repeat what the motion, you recorded the motion, Mr. Director?
Well, I'd like your help to make sure I got that right. The motion was to recommend to the full CVTA to consider submitting a letter to the CTV, the Commonwealth Transportation Board, in support of the I-64 widening project with a funding amount or potential.
I don't think it was to consider, I think it was to submit a letter with the dollar amount to determine. So it's not to consider, because consider would mean, it's not really a recommendation, it means just to talk about it. That's what I wanted to clarify.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll defer to Mr. Carroll.
Yeah, again, I wanted to get it before full committee to be able to make a recommendation.
So
For
it's
them to
not-
vote,
It's to submit it, not to consider submitting.
yeah. All right, I want to, I mean, again, we can take an up or down vote in the full committee, but they need to, everybody needs to have an opportunity to weigh in on, right now.
And I just add, this is just a clarification for staff before we get there. All these numbers we've talked about today need to be available to everybody in the
Well,
CVTA.
and I also think that the same questions may came up that were answered by Mr. Mann and Mr. Brown. So hopefully the members will have an opportunity to go online and actually review this meeting ahead of time, which will help them in the full committee. We finished the vote?
Yes, we did, yeah.
We just wanted some clarification.
Right, yes, to make sure that.
Just want to make sure the staff is getting this ready for it.
Just to Todd, put a bow on this. Hopefully, we have a budget by, well, we gotta have one by June 30, right? We gotta have one by June 30. So hopefully we have a budget by June 30. So that you get one piece done. We'll know what the grant application is, that's gonna go in today, so we'll have that piece done. The thing I would just remind everyone, and I know that, I've said 100, the secretary asked for 125. That at the end of the day, this body will decide what that number is in light of the request. But it's like anything, right? Horseshoes does count, right? I mean, getting close counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. And I think that when you're dealing with a project of this scale, if you get close, just like we did with Fall Line, just like we've done with other projects in my time on the CTV, the ability to find the money to close the gap will be there. So I just want to press upon this group to not get so focused in on the decimal point, because when the collective will and sentiment is there, and it's demonstrated by the regions and the state, we can find, right, a few million here or there, right? I mean, there's discretion that I'll have, right, as the CTV dealing with the 180 million in the Richmond district to find that gap, to fill the gap. So that's part of why, not to be to be dismissive of it, is that we're not going to get within $10 million to fill doing this gap and the project fail. I can guarantee you that. So I just would just press that upon you. Don't, whether it's 100 or 100, if we want to be conservative, go with 100. I'll find them with 25 million.
Sure. Just to add to that, again, we have one smart scale project from 205 to 211. So we may end up generating funds, and that's the part we get to do first.
Yeah. But what I was texting with Ms. Page, the challenge there, and we've seen this, is that because of the cost benefit analysis, if you try to fund a very narrow piece, 5-6 miles at that cost, the cost benefit won't bear out.
You gotta do it
And
all
that's
one
what we've
time.
seen.
I agree.
But I will tell you how we got the first, what was it, 200 to 205 done? That was us finding money. We found money, about $50 million out of the CTV, to get that done. But it was not, again, it was like some creative work that we had to do with the Secretary's office and others to take care of that project. But I think that generally, if you follow the scoring process, a narrow portion does not score well relative to, we've run scenarios, scoring scenarios. And what we know is that if you do the whole thing, it scores well, it'll compete well. You do a narrow nub, it won't score as well.
That's the information we need to know.
Future meeting topics will include the financial policies, review and amendments, regional projects, fund allocation, just FYI for members of this committee. And are there any more comments from the members? Seeing none. The next meeting of the Finance Committee is June 8th, 2022. And with that, we're adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
We got another meeting right after this.
Not enough to keep you on the next officio. Which I do like that idea.
Yeah, right.
Monday morning. I did want to leave something.
We came right out of the
Information was to
How's the day doing?
have a couple extra letters.
But that doesn't have to come from finance. The chair can recommend that. But it needs to happen sooner or later.
So the thing we need to think about is those applications do that.
Yeah.
We don't have the letters.
We never did. We take a baby step.
We did one for the CVTA. I can modify that.